Hello, everyone. It's Doug Woodward. It is great to be with you, and I'm so pleased to be doing another edition of the Hot Seat. I have been setting things up. I have a number of interviews that I'll be doing over the next 3 or 4 weeks, and so I'll be publishing probably about one a week. So make sure you got that little bell turned on so that when I post a show, you'll be notified. I'm up to almost 3,000 subscribers, which, I had done almost nothing in the last year to promote this show because of health issues, my own and my wife's. But a lot of that's kind of wrapped up. So I'm ready to get back in it. And of course, I'm working on writing. I'm always writing. But I've got a great guest for you tonight, a good friend, someone that sort of stuck by me through thick and thin, and he's had me on his show so very many times. And his name is Derek Gilbert. Derek, welcome.
Doug, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad that you are here. I'm going to put the speaker, or rather the audio, on the speaker, so we'll see it that way. That'll be good. So you just got back from a trip to the Holy Land, yet another pilgrimage for you and Sharon. And this show isn't about, it's not a travel log, but I know that people would love to have just a couple of highlights, maybe something that was unusual that happened in this trip, and anything that would be encouraging to the folks. Love to hear about it. So tell us.
Well, we like to go places that are not on the beaten track because we have always had a fascination with the weird and and especially as it relates to the Bible. And since we wrote, just over the past 7 years, as we dug deeper into the culture around ancient Israel, the more we've come to realize that Israel was surrounded by a bunch of people who worshiped the spirits of the dead, or what they thought were the spirits of their dead ancestors, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Hurrians to the north, who are the Horites of the Bible. All of them believed that the spirits of their ancestors still interacted with the living and had to be appeased, fed, given drink, their names remembered on a monthly basis, kings twice a month, because if you didn't, they ceased to exist in the afterlife, or they could come back and make your life really miserable. So we, in 2019, before the pandemic shut everything down, we had the opportunity to visit Gilgal Rephaim, which our friend Aaron Lipkin, who owns the tour company we partner with, calls Israel's Stonehenge. The thing is that Gilgal Rephaim is bigger, it is much older, and it is within eyesight of Mount Hermon, which is it's on the northern border of Israel. For people not familiar with it, it is where I think the best way to describe it quickly is that it was essentially the Canaanite version of Mount Olympus. It's where they believed their gods met. Their creator god El, who was the equivalent of Kronos in the Greek pantheon, held court there with Asherah, his wife, and their 70 sons. And that number 70 represented all of them. In other words, all the gods of the nations were the sons of El, and they all met on the summit of Mount Hermon. Well, about 30 miles south of there on the Golan Heights is this place called Gilgal Rephaim, which looks like, from above, it looks like a giant maze. It's concentric rings of stone. They estimate about 40,000 tons of stone compared to about 25,000 tons at Stonehenge that were put in place somewhere around 3,700 BC and maybe even earlier. And we had the opportunity this time to meet with the archaeologist who did the most recent dig there, Dr. Michael Freakman. Pastor Doug Van Dorn went with us. He's the author of the book Giants, Sons of the Gods. He was the first one to spot the Serpent Mound of Bashan, a quarter of a mile north of there. And so we went there and spent basically a day with Dr. Freakman, and he gave us his theories on this location. But then the following day, we went to another site similar to Gilgal Rephaim, but only about a third as big. So instead of like 5 concentric rings, it's like 3 around a central tomb, but it's on the bank of the Jordan River, the east bank of the Jordan River, about a mile and a half north of the Sea of Galilee. Dr. Freakman had written about it in one of his papers. I spotted it on Google Earth. So, you can see it from space, basically. And it's about half a mile from the place where Jesus called his first three disciples, Andrew, Peter, and Philip. And so when we started putting this together with geographic clues in the Bible, John chapter 1 in particular, where John is confronted by scribes and Levites who were sent by the Pharisees in Jerusalem to find out who is this guy John and why are so many people flocking to him. John 1 verse 28 says, these things happened in Bethany across the Jordan, meaning east of the Jordan River, where John was baptizing. Now, for 2,000 years, people have been trying to find Bethany east of the Jordan River because there is no place named Bethany east of the Jordan River. The only place anywhere in Israel named Bethany is the one on the Mount of Olives, which is just across the valley from the Temple Mount. So where is it? Well, Origen, the early church father, early church theologian, wrote in the early 3rd century that even though the oldest and best Greek manuscripts read Bethania, translated Bethany, that couldn't be right because there is no place named Bethany. It must be Beth Abara, and that's why our King James translation reads Beth Abara. Origen changed it because he couldn't find the place. But in 1877, a scholar and an explorer for the Palestine Exploration Fund, Lieutenant Claude Condor, who was a friend of Sir Charles Warren, who found the Moabite stone, the Mesha stela, and Warren's shaft, how Joab, David's general, got up into Jerusalem. Condor, his friend, tried to find it. And he said, it strikes me that Bethania, being the original text, is probably a transliteration of the 1st century Roman name, Botania, which was what the Romans called Bashan. Bashan across the Jordan. That is the land north and east of the Sea of Galilee. That was the kingdom of Og of Bashan 3,500 years ago, the first military target of Moses and the Israelites. And it is so covered, Doug, with dolmens, which are these giant megalithic structures, monuments for the dead. Wow. They look like tables, the simplest form, like a trilithon, 2 vertical slabs with a tabletop across the top. In fact, that's what the word means. Dolmen is from the Brittonic language. It means table. That the Israeli archaeologists have concluded that ancient Bashan, the Golan Heights, is essentially one giant dolmen field. So the 30 miles from the Sea of Galilee to Mount Hermon, east across the border into what is now Syria, just covered with these monuments to the dead. And on the bank of the Jordan River, the east side of the Jordan River, meaning it's across the Jordan, you've got this megalithic structure like Gilgal Rephaim, which Dr. Michael Freakman concludes was probably used in rituals for the dead. So considering that is across the Jordan, and that's half a mile from the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, we think we have found, well, 2 things. Number one, the actual historic location of the baptismal site of Jesus, which is not near Jericho, as the United Nations thinks. It is not at Yardenit, which nobody really believes, but it's a tourist site south of the Sea of Galilee. But we also believe that we've located the physical location of the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Because in Matthew 4, we read that when Jesus moved to Capernaum, which is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, about a mile from Bethsaida, it was to fulfill that which was written by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 9. That's the prophecy, the messianic prophecy. Unto us a son is born, unto us a child is given.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Jesus moves to this area at the south end of a valley through which the Jordan River runs between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee. And Matthew says this fulfilled what was written by the prophet Isaiah. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. The people dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned.
Wow. Well,
and then when we go back to Psalm 23, which is about the valley of the shadow of death, remember there's a line in that psalm that says, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies.
A dolmen?
Yeah, we think so. Sharon gave a presentation on this several years ago in Nashville, and like 300 people in this church all went, oh,
yeah,
at the same
really?
moment.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until this year that we kind of put the pieces together with the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, the Psalms 22 and 23. Remember, Psalm 22 is the one that says, bulls of Bashan surround me, the messianic prophecy of Jesus on the cross. And then the 23rd Psalm, which leads, it was basically, yea, though you lead me through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thy rod and thy staff, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. You put the pieces together, you think, okay, that's where Jesus was baptized. He's led into the wilderness, which is not the desert of Judea down near Qumran. It's the wilderness of Bashan, this ancient region devoted to the cult of the dead. And then he's taken up a very high mountain where Satan shows him the kingdoms of the world and tempts him. That can only be Mount Hermon.
True.
Yeah. And then 3 years later, he goes to Mount Hermon to Caesarea Philippi. And, for Peter's confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Oh, yeah. And on this rock, this 9,200-foot mountain, the Canaanite Mount Olympus, I will build my church. And the gates of hell, which is the grotto of Pan, this big cave right over here, will not prevail against it. And then he climbs the mountain for the transfiguration. Right. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that when we begin to understand the religious and the cultural context and the geography,
right,
it all makes sense. So, yeah, I know that there are. In fact, there's a good friend of ours who's an archaeologist recently published a paper defending the site near Jericho as the actual baptismal site of Jesus. And it's like, well,
maybe not.
I don't have the training or the letters behind my name, but I think it's pretty clear when you read in John chapter 1 that these things happen in Bethany across the Jordan. The next day Jesus appears. The next day again, two of John's disciples, one of whom is Andrew, sees Jesus and begins following him.
Yeah.
Andrew and Peter were partners in a fishing business with James and John on the Sea of Galilee. That's 90 miles from the UN site. So, back in the day, that would take a week to walk there. So it's not likely Andrew was discipling John the Baptist if John was baptizing 90 miles from his boat.
That's right. That's right.
Anyway, yeah,
tremendous.
That was the thing that we thought was just amazing stuff.
Well, tremendous. And you do kind of go off the beaten path and find things that are truly fascinating. And you're making some connections there that I've certainly never heard before. And it's fantastic. So really pleased to have you kind of recount those things. And it's so perfect because so much of what you've written about in your book on the return, the second coming of Saturn, so much of what you've written about, you sort of introduced that into the lingo that you just shared with us. There's so much there. So the material in the book is a bit challenging because there's so many names. But I ask you to perhaps give us the central thesis of the book, which is really surprising, and we will be discussing it.
I argue in the second coming of Saturn that there is an entity who rebelled after the fall in the Garden of Eden, the leader of the Genesis 6 rebellion described in Genesis 6 verses 1-4, called Samyaza by the Hebrews, known by many other names throughout history. And I kind of trace them chronologically through the book. He was called Kumarbi by the Hurrians, the Horites of the Bible. He was called Enlil by the Akkadians and the Sumerians, called El by the Amorites and the Canaanites, Dagon by the Amorites and the Philistines, Ashur by the Assyrians. He was called Milcom by the Ammonites and called the abomination of the Ammonites in First Kings. And then it becomes clear when you read First Kings and Second Kings that Milcom is the same as Molech. So this entity, Shemyaza, I argue, is Molech of the Bible. But continuing on further into history, he's Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn of the Romans, Baal Haman of the Phoenicians, and I argue that he will return for 5 months at the very end of the age as Apollyon or Abaddon, the destroyer.
Right. Why don't you, and that's fantastic, why don't you talk for just a few minutes about the origins of some of these gods? Obviously, if I pronounce it correctly, Samyaza. Is that correct?
Shemjaza. At least that's
Shemjaza. Yes. Okay. And obviously, he's the central figure in the story you're weaving. But give us some of the history a little bit, the names you just went through, kind of go ahead and take a little bit longer, trace the sort of the evolution and the geographical migration, if you would, of some of these concepts.
Shemyaza was described in the book of First Enoch as the chief of the Watchers who rebelled. First Enoch gives us kind of an expanded version of the 4 verses in Genesis chapter 6, where the creation of these monstrous hybrids called the Nephilim, the giants, are discussed. He and another character, Azael or Azazel, kind of emerge in First Enoch as the 2 ringleaders. Shemyaza appears to be the one who led his 200 colleagues into the corruption of the human bloodline by taking human wives and propagating children. Azael taught humanity how to make weapons and instruments of war, how to work metal and things like that. In other words, he taught forbidden knowledge.
Right.
So he's almost like a Prometheus character, Prometheus who stole fire from Olympus and was punished by Zeus. Anyway, First Enoch describes how these entities were punished, sent to the netherworld. That is confirmed, although they're not named in 2 Peter 2 and Jude verses 6 and 7. But when you read 2 Peter 2 in context, Jude 6 and 7 and the verses following, it's clear that the angels who sinned that they're describing committed a sexual sin. And the only place in the Bible we see anything like that is in Genesis chapter 6. So I argue that this Shemyaza character is to be equated with the angels who sinned, referenced by Peter and Jude. Interestingly, we find that in Mesopotamian religion, a group of supernatural wise men called Apkallu likewise were responsible for bringing the gifts of civilization to humanity. They came from the Abzu, which is the Sumerian word from which we get the word abyss. So they came from the abyss with gifts of civilization. And in one of the Babylonian texts, the chief god Marduk says that at some point in the past, he got angry and a flood swept over and he banished the craftsmen, the Apkallu, to the Abzu and told them never to return. So in the Babylonian myth, we've got this story of these supernatural entities who brought this knowledge to humanity and were punished by being sent to the netherworld. Then you come to the Greek and Roman religion, where you've got a group of older gods or elder gods, if you will, called the Titans, who were overthrown when Zeus was born and raised in secret because Kronos had been eating his children as they were born. To try to head off a prophecy that one day his children would overthrow him. Zeus was smuggled away by his mother, raised in secret. He returned, managed to get Kronos to vomit up his siblings, and they led a rebellion and banished the Titans to Tartarus, which is a level below Hades.
Right.
And in fact, the connection there there's actually a connection there to 2 Peter 2, because in 2 Peter, the apostle writes that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to, and the Greek word literally is Tartarus. He didn't send them down to the abyss or to Hades. He sent them to Tartarus, connecting this story to the story of the Titans of the Greeks. And if we accept as Christians that Peter was writing under the influence of the Holy Spirit, we have to accept that he was inspired to. It's the only place in the New Testament that word is used. And as our friend, the late Dr. Michael Heiser would say, if it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's probably important.
It's probably important.
Yeah. So,
well, there's
got good evidence there to connect that story to the story of the sinful angels from Genesis 6. So the Titans of the Greeks, the Apkallu of the Mesopotamians, were the sons of God from Genesis chapter 6.
Absolutely. Yes. Now, I was going to make one comment in the creedal Christian faith, more like the Presbyterians, the Episcopals, and so forth. The Apostles' Creed is repeated usually in the worship service, and there is a line in there that Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried. Before
he descended into hell.
But he descended into hell, and that, of course, that line has been stricken from most of the modern hymn books. like the Methodist that I grew up with, unfortunately, cough, cough. Uh, and you go, what's that about? He went to hell? Why did he go to hell? It's Jesus.
Yeah, but that's not actually what the Bible says.
Right.
In 1 Peter 3, beginning at verse 18, we read that for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which, in the spirit, he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah.
Mm.
Now, the Greek word translated spirits there, pneumasin, does not, in the New Testament, it never refers to human spirits unless it is qualified as such, and it is not here.
Mm-hmm.
So what has happened here is Jesus has descended into the abyss, probably.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know, because Peter says he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. But the spirits in prison that he refers to in 2 Peter 2, the spirits that Jude refers to in verses 6 and 7, are those sinful angels.
Right.
And again, if we're putting the evidence together here, saying, okay, they're in Tartarus in 2 Peter 2, verse 4. So this is who Jesus went to see, the titans of Greek mythology, the Apkallu of the Mesopotamians, the sons of God from Genesis 6. Jesus went down and essentially proclaimed his victory over these entities.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, as the Roman Catholics would call it, the harrowing of hell, where he went and basically told human spirits in Hades that they'd be getting out. Jesus went and he declared victory over these spirits in Tartarus, a separate place from Hades, Sheol, a place reserved for these supernatural rebels. Mm-hmm. And boy, we found it, like I said, over the last 7 years, as we put these pieces together, this cult of the dead and this idea of resurrection, or of trying to maintain the spirits of the dead ancestors in the afterlife, is a constant in all of the cultures around ancient Israel, from Persia to Rome. This idea was part of everyday life. The dead were never departed from you. They were always with you, and you had to perform all of these rituals to keep the family spirits, the ancestral dead, happy and alive in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And they sort of represented like a middle tier in the spirit realm between us, the living, and the great gods way up above. Jesus basically going down into declare victory over the spirits in prison, basically saying, look, at dawn, and again, credit to Mike Heiser for this, at dawn of the third day, I'm getting out, but you, and I would add, and your hybrid offspring are still dead.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Well, all right. So let's jump up and kind of more broadly in terms of kind of where you're going. I think there's one term that you haven't said yet that I think you have to explain, and that is the Rephaim. What's the difference between the Rephaim and the Nephilim, or Nephilim? Well, depending upon how you say it.
I think the Rephaim and the Nephilim are essentially different names for the same entities.
Okay.
The Nephilim were the giants when they walked on the earth, and later they became, and Nephilim, usually the etymology is explained by Bible teachers as deriving from the Hebrew verb nephal, which means to fall. So the fallen ones, and that is accurate insofar as it goes. But Mike Heiser, to bring him in again, showed, I think, rather convincingly that there is a loan word from Aramaic, naphilah, that literally means giant. And so when you Hebrewize the plural form, because the Hebrew, or rather the plural form of a noun in Aramaic is in, so it'd be Nephilim. But in Hebrew, if you Hebrewize it, as it were, it becomes Nephilim, literally the giants. So the word Nephilim literally does mean the giants. In fact, that word in Aramaic, Naphilah, is their term, or was their term in ancient days, for the constellation Orion, the giant. So the Rephaim, that is a word that probably derives from an ancient Akkadian word that roughly means to be large or great. So the Rephaim would literally be the great ones, or the mighty ones. Dr. Judd Burton.
I was going to ask, is it not the case that I'm thinking the term Nephilim is not used much. Is it used anything beyond Genesis 6:4? Used one other time? Same passage?
Numbers 13:33.
Yes,
Where the
13:33.
spies, right? The spies return from
Mhm,
scouting out Canaan, and they
mhm.
bring back an evil report and
Right,
say that the
right.
Anakim are there, and they come from the Nephilim. So,
Yeah,
uh,
so the point I was going to make, thank you for clarifying that, is the word Rephaim is used in many cases
right.
throughout the Old Testament. So what's the difference? So there must be some difference if the word is chosen um, in most of the cases where we're referring to these great ones that are dead. All
Mhm.
right. So explain that if you would.
I think the difference is that the Nephilim was the term applied to them when they walked the earth, and
Okay.
that the Rephaim is the term that applies to them um, after death.
Hmm.
Now we know that there were tribes that were counted as Rephaim in the time of Moses. The Emim, the Zamzumim, the Anakim were counted as Rephaim. I think that, and this is the direction Sharon and I have taken in our research. We have no problem believing that there were giants who walked the earth in long ago.
Right.
Certainly in the pre-flood era, the Bible's very clear on that.
Hmm.
Less clear in the post-flood period, and I know there are people who study the Nephilim and the Rephaim and argue over the second incursion theory. Were there other angels who
Right.
sinned and came down and commingled with human? We can't prove that until the day that we can actually, national treasure style, bust into the Smithsonian and
Hmm.
expose the bones to the world.
Hmm.
We're focusing on the things that we can show, and we can show from texts that have been discovered within the last 100 years that there was a cult that venerated these spirits, literally called Rephaim or Rapayuma, by the Amorite neighbors
Mm.
of the Israelites.
Mm.
And we can show that these texts actually have some crossover with the Bible.
Hmm.
Some of the terms used for these Rephaim show up in very surprising places in the Old Testament. So I think, in a nutshell, though, the Nephilim, the term used for these giants when they walked the earth, Rephaim, the term applied to them, to their spirits after death, and also to the tribes that worshipped them. I
Mm.
believe that's
Mhm.
the direction we took with our book Veneration. Um, it is clear that the Rephaim were believed to be supernatural entities that could affect um, the natural realm,
Mhm.
and so there were sacrifices that were made to them at the Amorite city of Ugarit, which is in northern Syria on the Mediterranean coast.
Mhm.
But about 25 years ago, a scholar named Amar Anus published a paper titled "Were There Greek Rephaim?" And
Mm.
he showed that a term used in some of these Ugaritic texts applied to a legendary king from long ago named Daniel. By the way, I guess that was a popular name back in the ancient Near East. Daniel
Right.
was called by a term that he showed was the origin of the term used by the Greek poets Homer and Hesiod
Mhm.
for the demigods who lived in the days when Kronos ruled in heaven. So
Okay.
the demigods like Heracles and Perseus were the term meropes anthropoi in the Greek. That word meropes derives from the same Semitic root from which we get Rephaim.
Yeah. Oh.
So yeah, I mean, it's like,
Well,
okay,
this
and you
this
get this
story
from a
clearly.
secular scholar.
I was gonna say this story of giants, Rephaim, and so forth. Um, it's not just in a few passages in the scripture. It's clearly something that is very broad in the Bible in terms of the scope of this, and that's really mind blowing. But I have to say, after reading your book, and I'm about halfway through Doug Van Dorn's book, it's that's the that's like the amazing insight that you come away with is like, this story about the giants in Genesis 6:4. You think it's just sort of one little thing and maybe it kind of explains the flood, but no, it's like it's woven in the tapestry of scripture almost throughout the scripture. And
It really is.
yeah, and so you might comment on that.
The word Rephaim is once you get past the time of Joshua and his victory over the Anakim in Canaan, and it's pretty clear when you read at the end of Joshua. I believe it's chapter 11. I'd have to look, but there's a summary there that describes, Joshua had basically eliminated the Anakim from the hill country of Judah, the hill country of Israel, only in Ashdod, Gath, and the other Philistine city, Ashdod, Gath, and I'm forgetting the third one. But anyway, that's relevant because
Ashkelon?
later Ashkelon, I think so.
I
Where
think so.
400 years after Joshua, David and his men have to, take out Goliath and his buddies.
Right.
But there are many other references to Rephaim in the Old Testament. It's usually we miss it because usually it's translated as the dead, the departed, the shades, something like that.
The shades.
For example, there is a section of Isaiah chapter 19, which I argue is end times prophecy. I'm sorry, Isaiah 26 rather, that I argue is end times prophecy and a prophecy of the destruction of the Rephaim. Beginning at verse 13 in Isaiah 26, we read, "O Yahweh our God, O Lord our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone we bring to remembrance." And this is, by the way, Doug, a slap at the cult of the dead, because as part of the monthly veneration of the ancestral dead, the ritual performed by the Amorites every month on the 30th of the month, because that was a night of no moon on a 30-day lunar calendar, they would have to summon the ancestors by calling their names.
Wow.
And then they would have a ritual meal and pour out a drink offering to keep the ancestors alive in the afterlife. But here Isaiah is saying, other lords have ruled over us, but your name alone we bring to remembrance. The others are going to be forgotten and fade away to nothing. Verse 14, they are dead, they will not live. They are Rephaim, they will not arise. To that end, you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. Again, another slap at this cult of the dead. And then in verse 19, Isaiah,
if you are a Rephaim, you have no chance to be resurrected.
That is correct. And I think Ezekiel prophesies that as well at the in Ezekiel 39, the war of Gog and Magog. But in verse 19 of Isaiah 26, he writes, your dead shall live. This is a prophecy of the resurrection of the faithful, a prophecy of resurrection in the Old Testament. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light. And now this last sentence here, I think, was badly translated in most of our English Bibles. The ESV reads, the earth will give birth to the dead. The earth will give birth to the Rephaim. That seems to contradict verse 13 and 14 above. But the word translated give birth, ironically enough, is that Hebrew verb naphal that scholars think is the root behind the word Nephilim.
It's mistranslated.
And when you do a search through the Old Testament using Bible software, because I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I know how to use the search engine, you find that every other place that verb is used, naphal, it means exactly that: to fall, has fallen, fall down, will fall, has fallen. Suddenly here, in one verse, they translate it give birth, because I don't think they knew what to make of it. It's only been the last 40 years or so that scholars have realized that there was this cult of the dead around ancient Israel. The better translation here, and this is the way it's translated in the Septuagint, which is, in your bailiwick.
Which of course probably means it's right, but go ahead.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. The land of the impious, or the land of the ungodly, will fall. Or if we take the Masoretic reading, but just translate that verb naphal correctly, the land of the Rephaim will fall.
Yeah.
And scholars have looked at this, said this can only refer to Tartarus in the land of the Titans, the sons of God from Genesis chapter 6. So in Isaiah here, you got a prophecy that we, the faithful, will be resurrected, but not the Rephaim, and certainly not their progenitors, not their parents.
Right. Absolutely. Man, it's amazing stuff. All right. So let me push back on one element. This is the hot seat. All right. So the after flood, the incursion, where did the giants come from? You already mentioned Numbers 13:33. We know about Og. We know that the Israelites came back with the 10 of the 12 came back with a bad report because they saw the giants in the land, and they said, we are as grasshoppers and they see us as grasshoppers. So clearly there were giants, and that was really one of the primary objectives of Joshua's conquering of Canaan was to wipe out the giants. Now, he didn't get the job completely done. That's why this guy named Goliath pops up, and he and his brothers, and they also are giants. They're perhaps 10 feet tall.
Well, let me tackle this here because I think I can answer this.
Okay.
First of all, we don't know that Og was 9 cubits or 13 feet tall.
Okay.
His bed was 4 cubits by 9 cubits. But that just happens to match exactly, and we know this from an inscription found at the site of ancient Babylon, that matches exactly the dimensions of the cultic bed in the temple of Marduk, where it was believed that Marduk, on the New Year's celebration called the Akitu festival, would have ritual sex with his consort Zarpanatu to bless the land for the coming year. And this was, scholars debate whether the king stood in for Marduk, and there was a hierodule, a temple priestess who would stand in for Zarpanatu. But the point I think that Moses is making is that the bed of Og was echoing, because Og was an Amorite, and the kingdom of Babylon was founded by Amorites. Hammurabi the Great was an Amorite. There is no ethnicity, was no ethnicity called Babylonian.
Right.
It would be like saying I am a Chicagoite because I was born there. No, sorry, I'm German, English, Swedish, Welsh, and a few other things. So I think what Moses was doing was connecting Og to the occult wickedness of the kingdom of the Amorites based in Babylon by connecting that the size of his bed. Now, was he of unusual size? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, just mentions the size of his bed, but I don't think it's coincidental that it was the same size as the cult bed in the temple of Marduk.
That's a great point. Now, how about Goliath?
Goliath. Well, Doug, in the Septuagint, as you know, Goliath was mentioned as being 4 cubits in a span rather than 6 cubits in a span. So he was 6'9" rather than 9'9". Now, that is still really, really big. I looked this up. The average Israelite in the time of Goliath, around 1000 BC, was about 5'4".
Yeah, that makes sense.
So he was still really, really large. But I think the clue here is, again, in what kind of occult practices they were engaging in, more so than whether or not they were literal blood descendants. We see in 2 Samuel 21, beginning at verse 15, where it describes a war with the Philistines, and David went with his servants and fought with the Philistines. And David grew weary, and Ishbi-Benob, a really bizarre name. This is 2 Samuel 21:16. One of the descendants of the giants. That phrase translated there, and we see another named Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. Same phrase in Hebrew. It's Yeladeh ha-Rapha. And ha is the Hebrew definite article the, so descendant of the, but Rapha is a singular form, descendant of the Rapha, or perhaps descendant of the giant. Rapha is the singular form of Rephaim. But Yeladeh does not mean blood descendant. It does not mean a genetic inheritor of whatever DNA the Nephilim in the pre-flood era had. The word Yeladeh actually means one who is a member of a group into which one is initiated or consecrated. In other words, this was probably a warrior cult who venerated or worshipped the Rephaim. And I think the clue is in the name of this this guy, Ishbi-Benob, which actually should be pronounced Ishvi-Ben-Ov. And that second part of his name should be split. Ben-Ov, meaning son of the Ov. And in Hebrew, Ov means medium, or at least that's how it's translated into English. A scholar back in 1966, Harry Hafner, who was a Hittiteologist, showed that the word Ov in Hebrew derives from a Hurrian word. Archaeological joke here. The Hurrians, not to be confused with the Russians. The Hurrians are the Horites of the Bible. The Hurrians had a sacred area that they called the Abi, A-B-I. This was a ritual pit that they dug into the earth. And they used it to summon spirits.
I wanted you to explain about the ritual pit. I found that fascinating.
And I wouldn't have found it if Sharon hadn't pointed me to the research of husband and wife archaeologists, Giorgio and Marilyn Kelly Bucciolati, who who spent years digging at a site in northern Syria. Sadly, they've not been able to get back there since 2011 because of the civil war.
Yeah.
They found the ancient Hurrian city of Urkesh, which was known from other texts in the Middle East. I suggest in the book that Urkesh might be Kasdim, or of the Chaldees,
Right.
hometown of Abraham.
Yeah.
That's speculation. Don't know. Certainly, I think Abraham is from northern Mesopotamia, not from Iraq, so southern Iraq. But
right.
Anyway, at this site,
we agree on that. Go ahead.
Excellent. At this site, Urkesh, they found the temple, and next to the temple, this ritual pit that went down, they estimate, about 40 feet. And they could only go down about halfway because they were concerned about the stability of the walls. Oh. But this dates back to the middle of the 4th millennium BC. So 3500 BC, they were digging this ritual pit to summon spirits from the netherworld, the Abi. And again, that's where not only did the Hebrews get the word Ov from there, the Sumerians, he argued, got the word Abzu from the Hurrians.
Right. Okay.
And Abzu, again, is where we get the word abyss.
Right.
So this is a very
fresh water, though, as I remember.
Right.
Right. But it is abyss. Yes.
And when we remember the story of King Saul going to the medium of Endor, or the Ov of Endor, the night before he dies in battle with the Philistines, Samuel's spirit comes up from the earth. Why? Because she's using a ritual pit. She dug a hole, sacrificed something, and then God surprised her by allowing the spirit of Samuel to return. But this is a practice that we can trace back through the Hurrians to at least 3500 BC. And then because they use a really unique style of pottery that archaeologists have been able to trace, it distinguishes their culture from the other cultures around them. We can trace the origin of the Hurrians to the plain of Ararat, which is the plain below the mountains where Noah's Ark came to rest. Sometime around 4500 or 4000 BC, they began to spread out and brought their occult practices with them. And they wound up in the Holy Land, where not only were they teaching the Israelites, apparently, how to summon spirits from the netherworld, but they were in control of some very important places. Like I argue in the book that the Jebusites, who David took Jerusalem away from, were actually Hurrians. And the evidence is that when David bought the threshing floor of Araunah, that name, Araunah, is not a proper name. It is a Hurrian word that means Lord or King. It is a title. So, and you got the Hurrians at Hebron, Talmai and Sheshai. Those are Hurrian names. And we read in the War of Nine Kings, where the kings came from Mesopotamia in the days of Abram and Lot, and they did battle with the Horites in the wilderness of Paran. That's down near Mount Sinai. So they were all over the Holy Land, and their influence, spiritually speaking, in terms of trying to communicate with these spirits of the netherworld, is all through the Old Testament.
Now, the Hurrians are not the Hittites. Is that true?
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Their texts were preserved by the Hittites, which is why we know so much about the Hurrians. The Hittites were sort of like, they tried to absorb the gods of all of their surrounding nations. So, it's like, in fact, there's some texts that almost read like travel brochures, for the spirit realm. Hey, come to the land of the Hittites. We have the best sacrifices. Right. So they preserved those Hurrian texts. The Hurrians were very important in the ancient world from about 3500 BC down to about the time of the Exodus, around 1400 BC. The last major Hurrian kingdom was called Mitanni. And it was essentially in the region occupied by the Kurds today. There are some who think that the Kurds may be descendants of the Hurrians.
Right.
But northern Iraq, southern Turkey, northern Syria, that was kind of the home country of the Hurrians. And again, it was from that area that Abraham came when he went to the Holy Land. And he encountered other Hurrians there, as did, going down another 800 years, so did David.
Right. Now, one of the issues that I have with your thesis, which I find fascinating, and I'm eager for you to tell us more about why you think this, but clearly the centrality of the Satan, the adversary, that's lost in your book. In other words, you are really focused on Samyaza. I need to see the word in front of me. I can pronounce it better. And you're focused on him and his influence, even from the pit. And So help us understand, what's the context? Where does Satan, Lucifer, the dragon, where does he fit in to this
Okay.
story?
To be clear, I argue in the book that Lucifer is not Satan, it is Shemyaza. So I think the
Oh,
rebel
okay.
described in Isaiah chapter 14 is Shemyaza and Ezekiel
Right.
28.
Does that
We
mean that you don't believe there is a different personality that's represented by the term Satan or by the devil, the dragon, of
Oh
Revelation?
no. I think they're two separate entities. I think what
Okay.
we're looking at here is a rebellion that's much bigger than just Satan and some minions.
Okay.
I think I'm okay with the idea that the rebel in the garden in Genesis chapter 3 is Satan. The
Okay.
Nakash, the serpent in Genesis 3, I believe.
Hmm.
I believe that's Satan.
Hmm.
Genesis 6, you've got a different rebellion led by Shemiyaza and Azazel.
Yes.
And I've kicked this around with friends. Sharon and I. We have really weird conversations here at home. That
Yeah, I'd like to just listen in sometime. Here you
it
guys
is a
talk.
blessing to be married to somebody who gets you and
Yeah.
really finds this stuff really interesting.
Yes, yes, it is.
But we've also talked to people like Timothy Alberino, L.A. Marzulli about this,
Hmm.
and speculated what role would Satan have played in the Genesis 6 rebellion? Because when you
Right.
look at Satan in the Old Testament, there is no connection. And I think we also need to throw this out there, which blew my mind because I only learned this, within the last year. I knew that in the Old Testament, the definite article "the" is there before the name Satan.
Yeah.
So it is not
The
Satan, it is
Satan.
the Satan.
Right.
But that's the case in the Greek New Testament as well.
Mm.
It is ho Satanas. It is the Satan.
Hmm.
So it's not a proper name. I think there may be
Title.
two places in the New Testament where it's used
Mhm.
as a proper name, but it became a proper name in the centuries after the
Mhm.
resurrection. The
Mhm.
early church made Satan into the character in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. But that's not how he was viewed by Jews, including the apostles. And it's not how he was viewed by the early church, the first few centuries. Our friend David W. Lowe wrote a book 15 years ago called Deconstructing Lucifer.
Right.
When I read that, I just kind of laughed. It's like, oh, David, of course Lucifer is Satan.
I
Well,
know. He
David,
makes
just
a
for the
good
record now,
case. He makes a
yeah,
good case.
I've come around to your way of thinking.
Hmm.
So I think you got that rebellion in Genesis chapter 3 with the Satan, the accuser, the adversary. Genesis 6, you got the rebellion there with Shemiyaza as the leader of the group. Um, and clearly, and then of course you got the Babel incident, which was probably Nimrod and the people of his day trying to reestablish contact with the gods who once walked among humanity and taught us
Hmm.
all of these really cool magical things and stuff we're
That's well
supposed to
said.
know.
I think that's right on. Yes.
But something happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament because we see in Matthew chapter 12 where Jesus is confronted by scribes and Pharisees who say he's casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, which
Right.
means Baal the prince, Baal the
Hmm.
prince of demons. And Jesus replies by saying, if Satan casts out demons by his own power,
Hmm.
how will Satan's kingdom stand? Two
Hmm.
important bits of information there. Number one, Baal is Satan.
Hmm.
Number two, he's got a kingdom now.
Yeah.
When did that happen? Because that's not anywhere in the Old Testament. There's no connection between Satan and the Rephaim in the Old Testament, no connection between Satan and the underworld in the Old Testament. So that's one of the
That's
problems I always
fascinating.
had trying to figure out Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, that
Right.
the rebel is cast down to the netherworld, but you never see. And again, I will repeat, as David Lowe wrote in Deconstructing Lucifer,
Hmm.
that's not how the Jews of the Second Temple period saw Satan. They did not connect him to the netherworld or to the Rephaim, the giants of old. That was somebody else.
Right.
I
Right.
argue that somebody else is Shemiyaza. So
Hmm.
is it possible? And
Hmm.
this is where, L.A. Marzulli speculated, and that's a really interesting idea. Is it possible that Satan, who we know from Genesis 3 is, really crafty, really
Hmm.
subtle,
The Nakash.
the Nakash said to Shemiyaza, hey, uh, Yahweh has given this great planet to these monkeys here and given them dominion over it. You, and if I'm right about my theory, by the way, because in
Right.
Ezekiel 28, this rebel in Ezekiel 28, who I argue is Shemiyaza, leader of this
Hmm.
rebellion,
Hmm.
every precious stone was his covering. which, going back to the Septuagint, which we learned from you, Doug,
Mhm.
the Septuagint describes those stones as the same stones that you find in the ephod worn by the high priest.
Yes.
So, is it possible Satan's talking to Shemyaza and says, look, you're the high priest in Eden, and now he's given these monkeys dominion over this planet? Are you just going to take that? And so he goes down with his 200 colleagues thinking that they're going to take dominion of earth away from the children of Adam and Eve by creating their own hybrid race of giants. Maybe they even knew that they would be punished for it. Maybe Satan said, hey, don't worry. We'll totally bust you out of the abyss. Except there was no jailbreak. And that what Satan was actually trying to do was eliminate a rival for the throne of God. It's just like in human politics,
Right.
all the Democrats may hate the Republicans sitting in the White House or vice versa, but they will fight with each other to be the one to replace the guy they want to get out of office.
Right. Well, absolutely. And there's a lot of logic in what you've just stated. It still is such a radical idea, however, that get ready to defend it, because you're going to hit a lot of speed bumps with that. But I found it a fascinating argument. And again, tying it back into this notion that the giants, as well as the sons of the giants, the demons, that they are influencing things throughout the world. It does lead to a question of how do the former 200 angels, how do they influence things in the world? In other words, they're deep, dark in the abyss. How is it possible that they still have any power over what happens on Earth? What do you think?
Well, it's a really good question, and I can only speculate on this, but I imagine it is the same way a mafia boss influences action on the streets while he's in prison, or a gang leader, controlling what happens in his neighborhood while he's in prison. They have minions, and there's a hint, perhaps, and again, this is speculative, and I admit it, in Ezekiel 32, beginning in verse 20, which is a polemic against the king of Egypt. So Ezekiel's writing a polemic against the king of Egypt in the 6th century BC, and he mentions in verse 21 that as the army of Egypt will fall amid those who are slain by the sword, Egypt is delivered to the sword, drag her away in all her multitudes. The mighty chiefs shall speak of them with their helpers out of the midst of Sheol. Now, the phrase translated the mighty chiefs there is Nophalim Gibborim. There are some who suggest that Nophalim Gibborim is actually a mispointed word, and it should be chiefs of the Nephilim. But in the Septuagint, again, you get the sense that they knew what it was supposed to say. The giants will say to you. So they translate that instead of the mighty chiefs, they translated the giants.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got the spirits of the Nephilim, the Rephaim, in the midst of Sheol. They have come down, they lie still, the uncircumcised, slain by the sword. Verse 22, and this is where I get speculative. There are a number of places in Scripture, in the Old Testament, where we read Assyria or the Assyrian. And again, the Hebrew definite article the is the word ha. So it should be, when it's the Assyrian, it should read ha Ashur. But very often it's not, it's just Ashur. The problem is that in Hebrew, the word Ashur can mean the nation Assyria. It can mean their capital city, Ashur. It can also mean their chief deity, Ashur, who was Enlil by a different name. Ashur was Enlil, who was El, who was Shemyaza, Kumarbi to the Hurrians, Saturn, Kronos, Molech, Dagon, same entity by different names. And I suggest that Ashur is there, and all his company, the ESV reads all her company, its graves all around it, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, whose graves are set in the uttermost parts of the pit. Yarkete Bor in Hebrew. Again, this is speculative, but if this is Ashur, Enlil, Shemyaza, in the uttermost parts of the pit, uttermost parts of the pit may be a reference in the Old Testament to what the Greeks called Tartarus, a separate level of the netherworld reserved for supernatural rebels. And it's possible then, if you've got the mighty chiefs in the midst of Sheol, perhaps they can communicate to these spirits who are in chains and gloomy darkness, according to Peter and Jude. again, I don't know for sure. I'm speculating here,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly when we look at the number of abortions worldwide,
Right.
one thing this entity Shemyaza was known for in most of his iterations, Molech for sure, but also Kronos, Saturn, Baal Haman, even Dagon, whose main nickname among the Amorites who lived along the Euphrates River was Lord of the Corpse or Lord of the Corpse Offering. Known for human sacrifice and often the sacrifice of children, and the number one cause of death on planet Earth for several years running now is abortion. So,
Right. But
how he does it, we don't know. But
you saw what Tucker Carlson got in trouble for saying this week, did you? Did you not? He mentioned in his one of his speeches in front of an Episcopal group, he actually called abortion child sacrifice.
mm-hmm.
And of course that may have been, it's explained that may have been what caused Rupert Murdoch to fire him. It's because he was so freaked out by some religious zealot, saying something crazy like that abortion was child sacrifice. And of course,
Yeah.
it's not hard for us to agree with Tucker on that.
No, I agree absolutely. And I think that's why after Solomon in the 10th century BC put a high place for Molech,
Mm-hmm.
who was this same entity, El of the Canaanites was Milcom
Right.
of the Ammonites, who was Molech to the Hebrews. He put a high place to Molech on the Mount of Olives. And so the priests began referring to it as the Mount of Corruption, except that that definite article, the, shows up in there again in the Hebrew. It's har ha mashkith. And our English Bibles just drop the because they don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, using a search engine, you can find ha mashkith elsewhere. It's mentioned in Exodus. It means the destroyer. Mount of the destroyer, har ha mashkith. And I double checked that with friends who do speak and read Hebrew. Rabbi Zeph Porat, Jonathan Kahn was at SkyWatch TV some time back, and he's like, "Hey, does this make sense to you?" He said, "Oh yeah, and so Mount of the Destroyer, okay, which is why I believe Jesus paid so much attention to the Mount of Olives during the last week in his life. I write about this in the book. He's
that was a shocking thing in the book that you talked about, which of course I didn't know that the Mount of Olives is called the Mount of Destruction. And wow, that of course Jesus was arrested there, and his disciples failed him, but because of future destruction, that's what it's called. That's fantastic.
Mount of the Destroyer. And then when he returns, of course, in Zechariah 14, that's where he lands and it splits in half.
Yeah. Talk about Apollyon and Abaddon, because they are also called destruction or destroyer.
Well, that's where I come up with the evidence, I think, to identify this character as the destroyer in the end times, Apollyon or Abaddon. There are references to Abaddon in the Old Testament, usually given in parallel with the word death. And I'm going to have to look this up now because this was really different for me when I was going through this. But I concluded, just to not to dive too deep in the weeds here, that that I think Abaddon, even though he's not really described in any depth in the Old Testament, I think Abaddon is essentially the Hebrew equivalent of what the Greeks later called Tartarus. And I can't find a lot of academic support for that idea. But I think it makes sense when
saying it's not a personage. It's more of a place.
Right. When you look up Abaddon in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, they'll admit that there are a couple of places where he's described as sort of a personage, but generally it's more of a place. But you see that in Greek as well, where Tartarus is also the one of the parents of the monstrous Typhon. But you also see Hades as the god of the underworld, but also a place. So I don't think it's that unusual to consider that Abaddon may be a place as well as a person, and used in parallel with the term for death. And given that this whole supernatural war is again about resurrection. Who gets resurrected at the last trump?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's that unusual to see the focus on death and Abaddon or Sheol and Abaddon in the Old Testament in a number of places.
Mm-hmm. Um, Another kind of loose end for me as I was reading the book was Nimrod. Of course, there's the belief, I think, from what you were saying in the book, as well as my point of view, is that Nimrod was a real person. He was in very much involved in the building the empire. Now, there's a question, of course, about whether or not Nimrod was the actual leader of the revolt at Babel. Now, Josephus says that he was. The work that I've done on the chronology from the Septuagint suggests that that Nimrod was probably not even born yet when Babel happened. It's probably his father Cush, and he was probably born roughly 100 years later. And Cush and his family, Nimrod and his other 5 brothers, moved to the Sudan, basically Ethiopia, Sudan, and then out of Africa, Nimrod comes. Perhaps Nimrod conquers his brothers. I talk about this in Rebooting the Bible. Perhaps he conquers his brothers. He conquers Mizraim, the Egyptians. So he has northern Africa basically as part of his empire. Then he moves in to Mesopotamia. He takes southern Mesopotamia, the cities there, and then eventually moves up to the area of Syria, where he creates Nineveh and 2 other key cities in the north.
Yeah, Calneh and Rehoboth
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the Kalna is, I think you said in the book, which is what I've heard before, is perhaps just an expression of in all these cities, or it's like there's 3, and like all of them Kalna is what that's referring to. But there's other references I talk about in terms of the Nimrod Empire moving towards Indus Valley, north to the Caspian Sea, and so forth. So, but one of the traditional beliefs is that Nimrod is going to come back from the dead. Nimrod is going to be resurrected. Our friend Peter Goodgame wrote a book that I think he doesn't support anymore, meaning that his theology has changed. But he wrote a book called The Second Coming of the Antichrist. And so in that book, by the way, he tends to date Nimrod about the same time that we do. I date Nimrod right around 3000 BC. You date him earlier, but Peter also dates him in the 3000 3100 BC timeframe. But he points out that Asher, who you've talked about as a location, as potentially a god, that Asher could perhaps be the Assyrian, and that he's acquainted frequently with Nimrod. And so you see that in quite a bit of Bible prophecy, that's who Asher is it's Nimrod, the Assyrian. And of course, he wasn't, he was of the ancestry of Ham, not of Shem. And Syria was territory that would have been dedicated to Shem. And of course, that tells us that when Nimrod was conquering that area, Mesopotamia and so forth, he was stealing land from the Semites, from Shem's ancestors or descendants. And so anyway, so what do you think about the hubbub around Nimrod? And we kind of have to wrap after we finish the
Well, as you say, I put him slightly earlier, but not much. And I just basically I base it on the archaeological dating of the kingdom of Uruk, which was the Bible tells us was the center of his kingdom. His kingdom was, the beginnings of it were at Babel, which I believe was at the city of Eridu in southern Iraq, and at Uruk, which was the city there. I'm okay with your theory. Because we don't know. The Bible doesn't say specifically that it was Nimrod. We read later that Josephus said that he was, but remembering that Josephus was writing probably 3,000 years later.
Right.
I think the bottom line is
go ahead.
That something was going on there that God put a stop to.
Right.
And the Bible records that. The archaeologists who dug at the site of Eridu and that temple of Enki, the Lord of the Abyss,
Hmm.
found that the level that they were trying to build, it would have been the largest ziggurat in all of Mesopotamia, larger than the great ziggurat of Ur that Saddam Hussein rebuilt,
Right.
larger than the Temple of Marduk, was abandoned suddenly and covered over with sand, just as the Bible tells us.
Yeah.
So, whether Nimrod was a returning conqueror who had left, gone to Africa, and come back, and I know Peter had written about that, about Nimrod being Narmer, the first
Right.
pharaoh of the
Hmm.
dynastic era in Egypt.
Right.
I think is a very interesting theory. There's certainly evidence there that the first pharaohs, the first kings of the dynastic period in Egypt, came from Mesopotamia.
Right.
Their architecture, their artwork, their iconography is all Sumerian. It's not
Hmm.
it came from earlier in Egypt.
Right.
So there's some evidence to suggest that that might be the case. Whatever it was he did, certainly this ancient temple
Hmm.
in southern Iraq that was the center of religious life in Mesopotamia for even down to the time of Nebuchadnezzar,
Hmm.
um, who reigned in the 6th century BC. So 2,500 years later, it was still a key religious site.
Yes.
God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saw something so unacceptable there that he
Hmm.
personally intervened. You got to be pretty bad for God to personally come
Right.
down from heaven and stop it.
Well, Nebuchadnezzar certainly believed that the ziggurat in Babylon was the Tower of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
He believed that, and he believed he was refurbishing it when he was king, and it had been refurbished before, a couple of times before, in the distant past, but it keeps getting torn down. There's a message there, I'm sure.
Yes, sir.
So there's so much in your book that I'd love to get into regarding the second coming, prophecy. You've clearly spent some time with Joel Richardson. I'll say that. and those for those who have ears to hear, let them hear. And so there would be some real challenges that you and I would have in discussing Ezekiel 38 and 39, Daniel Block's comments, etc. So yeah, so maybe we'll have a chance to talk again, maybe some kind of a roundtable, talk about Gog and Magog and whether or not that is, that Gog is actually Antichrist and so forth.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think it'd be a good session. So the book is the Second Coming of Saturn. It's a tremendous study in the gods, the deities of the Middle East, and really the migration of them till ultimately they become Greeks and then Roman gods, and hence Saturn, a name we're more familiar with, was actually the most recent name for a god that was known, obviously, by about 6 or 8 other names over 2,000 years before Saturn kind of came into being. So, yeah, Saturn was propaganda, is what I understand from Virgil. It was his propaganda.
Yes.
They'll get Caesar elected over Octavian. So that was interesting. So that's true with Derek's book. There's a lot of things you have to pay careful attention to because he's got a lot of Easter eggs hidden in that book, which makes for a lot of fun. So anyway, so I recommend it. So Derek,
I
thank
take
you
that
so
as high
much.
praise. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and bless you. All the great work you've done. Gee, I wish I could remember names as well as you do. I'm getting older though, and remembering names is becoming a real challenge for me. So
I feel you, brother.
yeah. Okay. So anyway, it's been great to be with you. Tell Sharon I said hi, and folks, until the next time, I hope that you will continue to be strong in the Lord and the strength of His might, and pray for us and our families. And we ask this really from Derek, Sharon, Donna, and Doug. We appreciate that. All right. Good night.